And you fucking nerds are wrecking it. You fucking nerds. You fucking nerds. That's right, you fucking nerds are wrecking it. You're ruining everything. And then fuck them all, man. Like, fuck Aquaman, fuck Wonder Woman, fuck Flash, fuck Cyborg, fuck Thor, fuck Hulk, fuck Black Widow, God damn it, man. Fuck Hawkeye, fuck, God damn it. Fuck Black Panther. Fuck him too. Fuck Black Panther.
Hey y'all, it's episode 117, and this week we're going to be talking all about a band you might be familiar with called Sacrilege.
Wrong.
Nah, that's the wrong band. That's the Swedish band from Gothenburg, Daniel Svensson's old project, Sacrilege, who, out of deference to the band we will be talking about this week, actually usually go by Sacrilege GBG for Sacrilege Gothenburg. No, this is the original band called Sacrilege from the UK. They started out as a kind of a crust band. What the fuck is crust? I'm not entirely sure. It's a weird sort of umbrella term for stuff that kind of sounds like Amoebics or Hellbastard, this weird kind of doomy punk shit. Often including atmospheric components like cleaner guitars, keyboards, slower tempos, and very nasty distorted sounds. This is Hellbastard, the band that invented the term crust punk, even though they weren't the first to play it. Amoebics was doing this kind of stuff before them. And actually a lot of these crust punk bands started out as being rather metal adjacent with their sound, and then later on turned into regular old metal bands. For instance, here's what Hellbastard sounded like a couple years after that first full length came out. That sounds a lot like very messy thrash metal to me. But it's still sort of in between like metal and punk. That's usually where a lot of these crust bands lay. Nowadays, as with most terms in the punk scene, it's sort of a murky area. Like Nausea is a crustcore band or whatever, and they sound nothing like any of these bands. And even back in the day, you had crust bands like Prophecy of Doom that was basically straight up death metal, and then bands like Axe Grinder that were playing some sort of like doomy atmospheric thrash shit. Sacrilege came out of that, and they were very influential. Nowadays, people don't seem to talk about them that much. I remember when I got into them, I had like more punk friends, and I would talk to them about that, and they'd be like, oh, I remember reading about those guys in like some book, some anthology about like crusty stuff, but they had never actually listened to the band. But this band were very influential on early grindcore with their very early stuff, specifically Bolt Thrower. A lot of times nowadays people will say Bolt Thrower, it says it's grindcore, that they don't really sound like grindcore. It's not very chorish, it's just death metal. Like, it's fast and messy, but it doesn't really fit the conventional grindcore mold you might hear nowadays, especially with these very heavy groove riffs. This is the first Bolt Thrower album, which is heavily underrated. Not a lot of people seem to talk about it that much. But yes, I know the episode is called Sacrilege, and we are actually about to talk about Sacrilege. I just had to give a little background. So that Bolt Thrower type stuff, I submit to you, might not even have ever existed without early Sacrilege. If that doesn't sound like an early Bolt Thrower riff, years before Bolt Thrower be doing this kind of stuff, to you, I don't know what to tell you. That emphasis on heavy tremolo picking on the root note of the riff, and that kind of sort of slapdash feel to it. Like, this sounds almost exactly like early Bolt Thrower, but it's years before Bolt Thrower started doing this kind of shit. And it's all very moshable. For, what is this, like 1984, 1985-ish? This is exceptionally extreme. Vocals remind me a bit of a very shouty version of Kurt Brecht from DRI. That's Tam Simpson, one of the first notable female vocalists in the more extreme side of metal. Her and Damian Thompson write most of the music for Sacrilege, or possibly all of it, kind of split between them. Even at this early stage, they were a band with a very dynamic sound, a lot of different textures. For instance, this more melodic song was just as influential on more extreme metal as their very chaotic stuff, but whereas the very chaotic fast stuff influenced Bolt Thrower, this influenced bands like Deceased. This is from 1993. This is off the 13 Frightened Souls EP. And the resemblance to Sacrilege is striking. Deceased always had heavy punk roots, despite being a very melodic death metal band, because they were listening to the weirder punk bands like Sacrilege and Die Kreuzen and whatnot.
Meanwhile, at the Hall of
Sacrilege.
Alright, back in Sacrilege land, this one's called The Shadow from Mordor. Because, like a few other bands, such as English Dogs and Amoebics, they were fond of using more fantastical and mythical metaphors to kind of diagnose societal problems. Usage of mythic metaphor in a very Michael Moorcock, Elric of Menibene way, to go back to Kira Thungle. Check out these fucking nasty vocals here, watch this. Absolutely demonic sounding. Personally, I love them. For some, she's a bit of an acquired taste. But yeah, a lot of these bands ended up going very mythical and occult in scope, kind of moving outside the boundaries of normal punk topics. Quite a few of them even got into like paganism. Some of the beginning of like neo-folk musical movements was born out of that. You even have like a main guy from Amoebics getting into swordsmithing later on, and starting up the new band Tau Cross to talk about 16th and 17th century occultism and paganism and stuff before he got in trouble for putting Gerard Menuhin, a well-known Holocaust revisionist, to put it lightly, in the thanks list of an album that ended up getting canceled because of it by Relapse.
No comment.
Luckily, Sacrilege never managed to have too many career pitfalls of that nature. They kept their lyrical concepts mostly to more apocalyptic themes on their earlier works, and then later on they went very philosophical and introspective. Their second album is often described as more of like just like a normal thrash metal album, which also happens with the second Hellbaster album, and in both cases, I couldn't disagree more. I got into the second Sacrilege album because Fenris from Darkthrone couldn't stop praising it, and it does have a lot of speed metal tendencies, but it's much more unique and strange than that. For starters, they kept the very reverb-heavy guitar sound, specifically this sort of fuzzy reverb that probably wouldn't be seen in too many thrash metal bands at the time. But the songs became very long and complex. They were already fairly complex on that first album. On this one, they just upped the ante in that respect. There's another part that sounds quite a bit like Bolt Thrower, just with a more speed metal solo over it. Really good guitarist from Damian Thompson, shooting a lot of good stuff out of his fingers on this album. Also, Tam's vocals have gotten less harsh, but actually a little bit better. I really like them on this. A lot of times you get like a female thrash metal vocalist, she won't sound very feminine. This one you can definitely tell that she's a woman, and it gives an interesting feel to the music. This riff is fucking dank. Watch this. Yeah, a little Destruction, Black Thrash-esque trill. Also a very common guitar technique in Hellbastard. And you could definitely hear that influencing riffs from Darkthrone once they got into their more black metal period. But where the Sacrilege influence in Dark Throne is especially evident is in their more atmospheric, epic thrash metal demos from the 80s, such as the Snowfall instrumental. Fenriz has talked about in interviews how two of his biggest influences at the time were Sacrilege and the Crumbsuckers from New York. So there's quite a bit of a hidden crossover thrash and crust punk influence in Dark Throne way back in the early days. That's not just a recent development on The Cult is Alive, like some people believe it is. Right, back on topic. Sacrilege. So, third Sacrilege album comes around, and wouldn't you believe it, they effected a fairly radical style change, which also proved to be very influential, sort of sparking off a whole new wave of doom metal in the British Isles. You can hear a lot of Solstice, and maybe even some of the more gothy bands like My Dying Bride in the third Sacrilege album from 1988. But is it really just a doom metal album? I'm not sure. Because this album is also very progressive and even downright technical at points. Damian Thompson must have locked himself in a bunker somewhere and really worked on his compositional skills with counterpoint and whatnot, as well as his guitar playing. Because you get these weird start-stoppy things with lots of harmonies and whatnot. Like, this sounds like the second Solstice album if you were to go really, really strange with it and bring in a lot of progressive metal influence. Look at these cool harmonies. The build-up to this song, and pretty much every song on this album is very long, is very complex. If you enjoy the sort of layering of sounds you might hear on the second Kirith Ungol album on songs like King of the Dead, you'll probably dig this. Very stately, and oft-times, such as now, not incredibly doomy for an ostensibly doom metal band. This is more just straight-up progressive, almost kind of power metal stuff during sections such as this. But even then, the songs aren't really structured like a typical heavy metal song either. They're a bit more complex, not always adhering to verses and choruses. Although they will have them, there'll be plenty of very complex bridges. That's a cool little melodic death metal bit there. And we fade into the next section of the song, where it turns into very triumphant sounding power metal. This album was hard to get for years and years. You can get it relatively easily now, but I think that might have been why it's kind of overlooked. Because I got the first two Sacrilege albums out of like a bargain bin at our used record store. This fucker used to be spendy to get. Moving along farther into the song to show off Tam's third of three vocal styles you've heard from her on this episode. It's kind of a more gothic style of crooning. Definitely pushing her vocal abilities to the limit in a very charming manner. Some people really hate the vocals on this album. I think they're well done. But yeah, compare that to the kind of shrieking and yelling, ranting you would hear on the first Sacrilege album. Now we have whispers and very angelic sounding high notes. This band went through a whole sea of changes in a very short time period, and all their stuff is pretty great. So you might be saying, that part didn't sound that doomy? Well, there are doomier parts on the album, don't you worry. Whereas the faster bits of this album were very influenced by bands like Trouble from Chicago, that sort of mid-paced, heavy use of pentatonics. The slower parts remind one a bit of Candlemass, with very stately, melancholic harmonies and an emphasis on percussive rhythm riffs in a very drawn-out manner. And now we're back into slightly groovier doom metal. Almost vaguely stoner if these guys were to go that route. But they don't. They keep it more esoteric and spiritual. Those are some cool palm muted harmonies. Very mysterious and triumphant at the same time. Wandering feel of the music. And that, in a nutshell, my friends, is Sacrilege. They influenced a whole bunch of different bands in a wide range of styles, and they changed their style quite a few times and did interesting stuff with each iteration of their sound. So, if that isn't a high enough recommendation for you, I don't know what to tell you. Go check them out, and I'll see you next time.
Well, what the fuck's this you got here, huh?
Oh, nothing, just blowing up the lamest X-Men character ever. Her name's like Jubilee or Jub something. I don't know, you've probably never heard of her.